What makes the achievement of emotional sobriety so difficult is the habits we have, the patterns we have in our behavior, the habitual ways that we've come to think about things. We have to really become aware of those things in order to challenge them, because the consciousness that has created a lot of the problems in our life cannot solve it, cannot change things. So what happens is the first step is waking up. What we're doing now is we're taking specific topics that are related to emotional sobriety, and we're exploring those. And the one I chose to dive into after we were finished with the 12 steps was this concept of differentiation that was first brought into psychiatry by Dr. Murray Bowen. And so this will be, I think, the fifth discussion of that. The first two discussions, I kind of tried to describe differentiation, what it looks like. And then I gave a talk on what low differentiation is about. And after that, the original intent was to talk about high differentiation. But I realized, especially in talking with a person who had been in with this meeting, it might be an idea to explore what happens to our consciousness as we start to move towards a higher state of differentiation. So the first thing I did was to talk about, well, what does our consciousness look like when our differentiation is low? How is it shaped by this differentiation or this low differentiation? Last week, I started to talk about what I called the transition to a higher state of differentiation. I would like to relabel last week's discussion as what happens in the early stages of that transition. Today, I'm going to talk about the middle stages of that transition, and next week, the later stages of that transition and how our consciousness changes. And last week, when I was talking about the early stages, is one of the things that happens as we begin to wake up and realize that our differentiation is low. I said the early stage of that transition is characterized by a suspiciousness that I may be part of the problem. We're not totally convinced yet. I mean, we're reserving the right to be victims. Let me put it that way. But there's a growing awareness that, I seem to be the common denominator in all these difficulties I'm having, right? We start to have a sense of that. And so with that suspiciousness in the early stage comes a curiosity. And we start poking around. We start to explore these things. We start to consider shifting our point of view. Right? So that's how this change takes place. Now, in the middle stage of that transition, I would say that sense of suspicion is replaced with a higher degree of certainty. We're no longer suspicious. We know that our problems are of our own making. We get a clarity about that at this particular point in time. And so with that clarity occurs what I've called here an active inner searching for what is keeping us tethered to these contingencies that we create in our mind that we need to be okay. So earlier when I was talking about is that one way of thinking about differentiation is that when our differentiation is low, we are very much tethered to the experiences we're having in our life. And we don't feel like we have much choice in terms of influencing those. Like we're the puppet on the end of those strings and somebody else is pulling those strings. That's the experience we have. You'll even see it in our language. We say things like, you make me feel this way. You make me angry, or you make me sad, or you're scaring me. There's a complete deflection of responsibility for the experience we're having. Well, as we make this transition from a tethered self to an untethered self, in this middle stage, we are now certain that nobody is making us feel anything. That's what I feel. I'm experiencing it. I'm angry. I'm scared. That's what I'm doing, not what you're doing to me, but that's what I'm experiencing. So there's an increase in our curiosity. There's an increase in our awareness. There's an increase in our clarity at this middle stage of movement towards this untethered self consciousness, or a consciousness of freedom is another way to think about it. We become entirely disillusioned at this point with this consciousness of contingency, this I'm okay if, or as Roger pointed out in one of his talks, the only if only things went this way, I'd be okay. I'd be fine. We're completely disillusioned with that. We're tired of being the result of all of these different forces in our life. We now know that we can have much more influence over our emotional well-being than we've realized. We are also, we see clearly how this attitude of I'm okay if keeps us tethered and emotionally dependent. We no longer have a doubt about that. We see clearly that, my goodness, I'm so dependent on this situation being this way for me to be okay. We get that clearly at this point in time. There's no longer doubt about how we are being lived by these forces of undifferentiation. The way Rollo May called it is that we become aware of how determined our behavior and our reactions are by these unenforceable rules in our emotional dependence. We clearly and undeniably know that we're on that merry-go-round that Bill talked about in the letter that Brian just wrote. But we also have not yet figured out how to get off of it entirely. Sometimes we discover one or two things, but it's not clear yet how we can completely get off of that merry-go-round. We are aware of how we take things personally. We become quickly able to identify it. God, I'm taking that personally. I'm taking this personally. That's why I'm getting so upset at this. I'm taking it very personally. That becomes almost automatic at this point. You'll see in the next stage, later development, it's an automatic that we say, oh, I've taken that personally. But we're moving towards that in the middle stage. We realize that we make things all about us. That this idea of personal importance that Don Miguel Ruiz talks about in the Four Agreements, we totally see how that's how we've lived our life, that this culture that creates narcissism that has affected us all, that we're also narcissistic, and we make these things all about us. We don't judge ourselves for that, though. We're just still at this middle stage, we're observing these things. We're going, wow, because that's that curiosity part, right? We're not putting ourselves down for this. And that becomes an important thing. We're observing these things. We're becoming aware of them without the evaluative component that so exists in the low differentiation. When disturbed, which is going to happen to each and every one of us, we get rid of this idea we should never be disturbed, right? That's another one of those crazy ideas that we have about how life is supposed to be. But when disturbed, we begin to search for our claims, the claims we have on the other person or on the situation, or the demand that we have that may be unconscious, or the unenforceable rule that's being violated, or the expectation we have. We approach these moments with an attitude of meaningful endurance, meaning that we are willing to feel that discomfort because we know if we stay connected to the process, I love how Herb says this. He says, if we stay gently pressed up against it, I've just added, if we stay gently and compassionately pressed up against it, we can learn so much from our pain, from our disturbance. We don't no longer need to run away from these things. Remember, that's what dominated us before. Low differentiation demanded we feel good all the time. Well, we've let go of that idea that being okay means feeling good all the time. And we now understand that being okay means being able to embrace whatever experience we're having in our life. We begin to recover our emotional balance when we're knocked off balance in a few days, instead of being lost for a week or several weeks or months or years at a time. That we're able to process the experience we're having and find and take that locus of control and bring it back into ourselves instead of keeping it attached to others. So our resilience, our emotional resilience, is increasing. As our emotional resilience increases, our confidence in our ability to cope with life is increasing. We don't need to control as many things because now we can take life as it is and deal with it. We're not so worried about things not going our way because we have this new capacity, this new ability that we're dealing with. We no longer accept a victim status or mentality. We actively search for the emerging opportunity when we are in conflict, when we are in pain, or when we're disturbed. In every one of those situations, there's an emerging opportunity for us to take the next step in our development. We actively search for those things. We begin to accept unconditionally that no one is coming. That this is our job, man. It's our job to now show up for ourselves and start to figure these things out. We begin to experiment with our response to situations. So we become response able. That's the way we split it up in Gestalt therapy early on. Fritz used to say, you become responsible in Gestalt therapy, which means RESPONSE-ABLE. We have the ability to respond instead of to react. So we become responsible in these situations. We begin to find the gap or the space between the stimulus and our reaction. We start to become aware that it's actually there. That there's a moment of consciousness that we have that says, wait a minute, I don't need to react to this right now. Let me hold on. Let me take a breath. Let me get centered a little bit. Let me get perspective before I say something. Or let me just keep my mouth shut long enough to have a second thought. Sometimes that'll be the best we can do. Dr. David Snarch used to say the best time to keep your mouth shut is especially when you think you're right. I mean, that's probably the best time to keep your mouth shut. We're less angry in this middle stage. We're not getting pissed off about things because we're letting go of a lot of these rules and ideas about how things are supposed to be. We're less anxious because we no longer have to control things. You know, we can roll with the punches better, that kind of a thing. We're less resentful and we're less frustrated during this phase. Things don't need to be what they are supposed to be for us to be all right. This is a big shift in our consciousness. We are no longer tethered to supposed tos, to shoulds, to have tos, to musts. We've let that go at this particular point in time. We see that that was not the path to glory and freedom, that was the path to incarceration, right? Our reaction gives way to a more thoughtful action. You've heard Herb say many times that low differentiation means ready, fire, aim. Right? You don't do the aiming. There's no thoughtfulness involved. And so now we're so much more thoughtful. Ready, aim, and then we fire. As a Marine, when I was taught to shoot the rifle, it was ready, Inhale, hold that breath and pull. Gently squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it. Squeeze the trigger. We lose interest in being right, and we are more concerned with finding a solution. So the concept of blame begins to fade in our consciousness, which means it also disappears in our language. We don't need to blame anymore because we're not interested in whose fault it is. We're interested in what the hell do I do about this thing now? Here it is. What does this mean and what do I do with it? That becomes the most important thing at this point in time. We become disillusioned with our idealized self, with the self that we thought we had to be okay. We start to see the problems that this created for ourselves very clearly. And we become much more interested in being who we are, in being authentic. So authenticity becomes such a driving force in our life when our consciousness is in this middle stage of the transition. We're also becoming acutely aware of the self-hate process that exists inside of us. And we begin to challenge it because we realize that so much of it was based on that idealized self and not living up to these expectations about who we think we had to be okay. We also begin to differentiate between what I'm going to refer to as introjections, and I'll explain that in a minute, and attitudes that are toxic. So a toxic attitude is any attitude or behavior that diminishes, right, our life, diminishes our connection to ourself. Healthy behaviors are behaviors that are encounter enhancing, that actually nourish our true self. So we become aware of when our behaviors are toxic and when they're nourishing. And we do that not by looking outside of ourselves for some kind of a 10 commandments that tell us how we should be feeling or what we should believe. We pay attention to the experience that these attitudes and behaviors create for us. So we start to become the final arbiter of our experience. We sift through our experience and say what's true and what's not true for us. We now begin to differentiate between what Martin Buber called the I to it relationship with others, and we start to have an I to thou relationship. So instead of seeing other people as an object and as somehow instrumental to meeting our needs, we see other people as they are and are not looking for them to take care of our needs because we're doing that. We are taking responsibility for ourselves. So our center of gravity is now much more over who we are and our true self than over our false self. So that's some of the characteristics of this middle stage of the transition towards a higher state of differentiation. So let me invite Roger in, and if Tom is with us tonight, and also Herb, to participate in a brief discussion of that, and then we'll open up the meeting for a share.
Hey, guys.
Hey, Tom. Good evening. Go ahead, man. Hey, Herb.
All right. Hey, Herb. I'll go because Alan, you're giving us all way too much credit. You're not describing the middle ground there. It's like you're describing differentiation, buddy. It's like if that's where I was supposed to be in the middle of that. Woo! I mean, for one thing, you said we lose the interest in being right. I'm going like, I know I've lost my keys 3 times today, but I have not lost my interest in being right. It's I know,
right. I see it sitting right on the desk behind you, by the way.
I know right where that is, buddy. It's like, and it's I loved what you're describing, and I love what you're describing in terms of, but I've heard it as a description of differentiation, and it's like I just want to add this idea of, you and I've talked about in the podcast quite a bit about the whole what we call reasonable doubt. That where you started with this stuff, where we begin to wonder, maybe it's me, and then we begin to make that, and I love this idea that reasonable doubt increases, and we become more uncertain until we begin to move back towards certainty. But in this case, it's certainty that we're the problem. And I there's something balanced about that I really love. But the piece I want to say, and I'm going to do this briefly, guys, I want to tell a real quick story about a client I had one time, because this is what it made me think of. Is I think the challenge in the middle ground is to basically just hang in there when you don't know shit. And it's really just in the middle of not knowing. And just saying, I call it the commitment to the commitment. It's like I'm going to make this commitment. And I'll just tell the story of I worked with a client one time who was a trapeze artist, and she was what's called a flyer. She's the one that would let loose and then be caught by the guy that's upside down. So I was curious and interested in this, and I asked her one time to describe what it was like to do that. And so she described this, and this became sort of a metaphor for me that I think about. It makes me notice how impossible this will feel to people in the middle ground of anything, where you have, because what we're talking about is where we have let go, but there's nothing to hold on to yet. And God has a sense of humor, but it's not a good one. And truly, she, whatever it is, always has this thing where it's like, nope, I'm not going to, I always say, I've always said, like, pay me half now, half when the job is done. And the message comes back, well, that's not really trusting. You got to trust. You just got to really, So here's what she describes. She says, so she's swinging, she's hanging by her legs on her trapeze, swinging back and forth. And there's a period of time, there's a moment in time where she's going to let go. And she says, here's what you do. She says, you stretch your body out entire full, and then here's what she said, and this was the part that just is still fascinating to me. She said this ridiculously stupid thing. She said, and then I become perfectly still. Okay, outstretched. Now, I know that when you're in the Wile E. Coyote cartoon, you can come off of a cliff and be perfectly still until you recognize that you're going to have to fall. But in real life, gravity exists. And I know that she is not perfectly still in that moment. She is in fact falling, and so she calls it perfectly still until the guy catches her. It's like, but to watch her face and to watch her demeanor as she described that, you realize that was a moment of peace for her. And it's like, and I don't claim that, I don't think in my recovery, metaphorically, I've gotten to that place, but it becomes a place where I in my effort for mastery of any of that, I reach for that. I try to keep that in mind. How can I be perfectly still when gravity is pulling me down? And I just want to say, I think the middle ground of this stuff is the scariest shit of all, because it's like you know so much more about who you are not than who you are, and you know so much more about what you don't want than what you want. And it takes a lot of courage. And this is a group who has been involved in doing a lot of that work over the last 2 or 3 years that we've been together. That's it.
Thank you, Tom. Herb, do you want to take the floor here?
Sure. I was struck at someplace in the middle, probably, of what you were talking about, Alan, with for me, the key to it was the two words came together as opposites, and that is identification and differentiation. And when I'm a puppet on strings, I'm identifying outside of me powers that are controlling me. And when I'm differentiated, I'm identifying powers inside of me that are influencing. And you use that term because I've banished the term control. I just don't think it's relevant. We have no control, but we have some influence inside ourselves and outside ourselves, more inside ourselves. And it was progressive. And you said that it was a progressive. I've just talked earlier in the prior session about the dimmer switch. And that was my experience. I did not know that I did not know. 4 years sober, thinking that I really knew. And then discovering it was a delusion because of some work I did in inventory, seeing my through my behavior, looking at my motives for my behavior. And that began for me the journey of taking full responsibility. Then I heard the step 10 spiritual axiom from the 12 and 12. Whenever I'm disturbed, there's something wrong with me, which startled me at first. And they obviously hadn't met my parents. And then after I did the inventory, I thought, oh, I get it 100%. No, they had an influence. They, rather than forming me, deformed me. But now I'm responsible because I have the reaction rather than the response. So it's my reaction that's the problem, not my parents. But I looked at that from the behavioral standpoint, which was easy to get at, and then look at the motives, which wasn't as easy, but it was more accessible. The next time I did the work, about 3 years later, I looked at my beliefs, much more subtle. I looked at the lenses through which I looked. And the subtlety is that I'm looking through the lenses to see the lenses. So it's really tricky stuff. But I had a guide who really was able to confront me, to get some clarity 3 or 4 different times that we met to discuss it. And finally, with some reflection and some prayer and some guidance, I was able to look at the lenses through which I was looking to see that they were distorted. And that I really did, you've seen the book from Chuck C., A New Pair of Glasses. I really did need a new pair of glasses so that I could see reality as it was, not as I am. Because when I'm looking through my distorted lenses, I'm looking through my distortions and interpreting reality through my distortions. No wonder I have trouble in dealing with relationships. So if any of that made sense, great. If it didn't, hang on and just stay with us and kind of do this work, because eventually it will. I really need and continue to need to grind on the lenses to keep them clear, because the ego will distort my lenses. One of the things I really, because I work with some men, and one of the keys is that they all need to be so right. They're a pain in the ass. Because, 10, 20 years of sponsorship, and they still want to be right. And so I have a large 4x4. Anyway, thank you.
I would put that as we, but there I go, expanding out beyond myself. But we need to be right, because I still certainly bump up against that part of me countless times each day. Herb, that is great, man. We need to look through we're trying to see the lenses that are distorting our vision, looking through those lenses. I love the way you put that. I remember a few meetings ago, you also said in terms of no, other people aren't responsible for what my feelings are, but we do have influence. And the phrase you used is the damage is real, right? We do react with hurt, we do react with anger. I just love that part of you that, understands the power of the principles, but also includes the much more pragmatic, much more down to earth. Yeah, the damage is real. And we have to contend with it, right?
Right.
Right. I appreciate all that. So just a couple additional thoughts. One is, for me, the gradual accumulation of awareness by trying to pay attention, by asking for feedback, which I'm still not very good at a lot of the time, that's what eventually allows me to start to press the pause button that can give me that moment that Alan and you, Herb, and you, Tom, talk about in terms of creating choice for myself. That's the moment for me where I can see myself just well enough and know myself just well enough to identify my reaction as it's happening, my defensiveness or my aggressiveness or my withdrawal or my placating and people pleasing, whatever my kind of typical pattern is. It's that pause and reflection that gives me the power, the freedom that I need to make a somewhat, hopefully, better choice in that moment. And until I have that ability to pause, I'm stuck. I'm just a conditioned response, inflicting myself on myself and the universe. Okay, that's one point. The other point is, in Michael Singer's book, The Untethered Soul, he talks about that the beginning of growth, particularly spiritual growth, for him, is when we begin to make our own consciousness the object of our awareness, rather than other people primarily and what they're doing or our life circumstances or whatever. The beginning of growth is where we really begin. And this is not narcissism. It's actually quite the opposite of it, right? It's an effort to start to see ourselves more clearly. And that made a big impression on me when I read that. We make our own patterns of reacting, our own belief systems that we developed as kids about who we are. You know, I'm not intelligent, I'm not capable, I'm not lovable, I'm not deserving. It's not just the traumas and the pain that we go through as kids that impact us. It's the beliefs we form about ourselves. That's why I loved you when you said you started to look at your beliefs, Herb. It's the beliefs we form about ourselves that become a huge part of those lenses that we look through. And as we learn to press the pause button and reflect, we can start to acknowledge things about ourselves that are painful. But because I'm not wrapped in that trance state of defensiveness and self-protectiveness, I don't feel as threatened by seeing more of my imperfections. I don't feel as threatened. In fact, I start to feel more liberated, freer. So I don't want to say more, but those two ideas, that a lot of the beliefs we have about our capabilities and who we are, we're actually much more than that already at a certain level. But unless we can pause and reflect, we're not going to be able to connect to those parts of ourselves that are already, you know, a lot more grown up than our child self would have us believe we are. So I'll stop with that. Thank you guys very much.
I hear a lot of people criticize the 12 steps, that they're old-fashioned. I can understand that criticism. They were written back in 1935. Some people that are agnostic have difficulty with the word God used in the steps. For me, I look at the process that's involved. The forces that the 12 steps generate are so powerful that I think they're ageless. There's this interesting phenomena that happens when you work the steps. They create a charge and then a discharge. You know, the first step, we're powerless. Our life has become unmanageable. It creates this charge. You know, we're in big trouble and we don't know what to do. And then step 2 comes along and it says we have hope. That charge, that existential crisis that we have is resolved. What's happening here is parallel to life. We charge ourselves when we breathe in. When we exhale, we discharge. That's the rhythm of life. And the way I love to think about the 12 steps, it's helping us get connected to the rhythm of life so we can learn how to show up in a good way.